In the epilogue to Night in the Woods, Aunt Molly can be found on Maple Street, just a few doors down from May's house. Primarily, this interaction serves as confirmation that Aunt Molly is not a member of the cult. But upon closer inspection, her presence here, along with her dialogue, tells us something very important. It tells us that someone on the street has gone missing, and therefore is a cult member. But who could this person be? And is there any other evidence supporting a connection between them and the cult? Today, we're going to try and figure all of that out. Over the last few months, I've been taking a close look at characters from Night in the Woods and speculating about potential connections between them and the cult. So far, I've examined Aunt Molly and the city council, but there are many more suspicious characters in the game other than just them. And unlike Aunt Molly and the city council, who we knew couldn't have been full-fledged members due to their presence in the epilogue, all of the characters I'll be covering over the next few weeks do not appear in that crucial section of the game. And there's no better place to start than with May's neighbors, Mr. Penderson and Mr. Twigmeyer. Let's start with Mr. Penderson. Mr. Penderson is May's cantankerous elderly next-door neighbor. He only appears in the game twice, on May's second day back in Possum Springs, and in her dream after her first confrontation with the cult. In both of these appearances, he makes it abundantly clear that he does not like May. This mostly has to do with some mildly delinquent behavior May engaged in when she was younger, like throwing eggs at his house and dropping an M80 down his chimney. But also the killer incident, which he makes sure to remind her about by the end of their first conversation. Based on this alone, I have a tough time imagining that Mr. Penderson is a cult member. The cult makes it very clear that they view May as a contributor and want her to join them, probably so they can make use of her connection to the Black Goat. When the cult's leader or spokesperson or whoever he is lets May and her friends go, Ide, and only Ide, speaks up about it. Mr. Penderson seems to be one of those elderly people who isn't afraid to speak his mind, no matter the circumstances. If Mr. Penderson was a cult member, he definitely would have had something to say about this. He views May as a menace and a danger to Possum Springs. The cult sacrifices people who fit that description. They don't offer them their eldritch business cards and let them go on their merry way. He's also not the right age to be a cult member. As explained by the unnamed cult leader / Grand Poobah, the cult has only been operating for about 20 years or so. Night in the Woods seems to be set during its release year, 2017, placing the origins of the cult around the mid to late 90s. Presumably, most of the cult members are, by the time of the games, middle-aged people in their 40s or 50s, people who were at the height of their working careers in the 90s, and thus would have been most affected by the shutdown of the mines and factories. But Mr. Penderson is elderly. He's probably in his 70s or 80s, meaning he was likely retired by the time the businesses left Possum Springs, so he simply wouldn't have had as much reason to join the cult. That having been said, based on his statements about May being a danger to the town, it's clear that he has a strong admiration for the history and culture of Possum Springs. As I've discussed in my previous videos, this is a characteristic of a cult member. As evidenced by what they say down in the mines, it's obvious that they have a reverential view of the town's past and reputation, and they seek to preserve that at all costs. This is hallmark conservatism, and while the only thing Mr. Penderson says about politics is that he doesn't approve of the mayor, I don't think it's a stretch to say that he's probably right of center. But most importantly, as I said at the start of this video, he is missing from the epilogue, which raises a huge red flag, especially when you consider the fact that the developers made sure to include him in the dream segment, indicating that they wanted him to be on our minds here at the end of the game. Furthermore, during May's conversation with her Aunt Molly, she says that she received some strange calls the night before. It's likely that Molly's checking in on those calls when May runs into her. She even begins to ask if May has seen someone, but stops short of saying who. Given where she's parked, I would not be surprised at all if she was about to ask her if she'd seen Mr. Penderson. So for Mr. Penderson, I'd say we have some decent evidence that he's a cult member, but a fair few things that counter that theory as well. Overall, I'd say that it's possible that he's a cult member, but personally, I think he's just an angry old man who likes to shout at the sky and tell kids to get off his lawn. But what about May's other neighbor, Mr. Twigmeyer? May first encounters Mr. Twigmeyer on her first full day back in Possum Springs. He's outside his house, raking some leaves when she runs into him. They catch up for a few minutes. She tells him that she's back for good. He says that he figured she'd either go on to do great things, or sit around and do nothing until she eventually put down roots, and then May continues on with her day. What stands out to me about this conversation is that although it is brief, Mr. Twigmeyer still manages to convey how the cult feels about May. They're interested in having her join them because of her connection to the Black Goat, what one might say is an example of doing great things. We don't see Mr. Twigmeyer again until the final act, when he appears in a dream segment after May is nearly shot by one of the cult members. I've seen a lot of confusion about this segment online, as some folks seem to think it's something that actually happened. I don't deal in absolutes, and anyone else's interpretation is as good as mine, but I'd be willing to bet my house that it's a dream, based on the nature of the dialogue, the fact that this moment is never referenced again, and most notably, the way the scenery shifts when the mysterious janitor arrives. In any case, during this scene, Mr. Twigmeyer's dialogue is incredibly suspicious. He begins by reiterating his appreciation for May, something the cult will do the following evening, and then goes on to say that sometimes folks is in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is a strange thing for him to say, considering at this point he doesn't actually know what happened to May. When May's parents explain what happened, his reaction is startling. It's as if he knows more than he's letting on, and stumbles at hearing their description of the events from the night before. He then closes by saying that he hopes she wakes up soon and tells us all about it. The emphasis there isn't even mine. It's right in the dialogue. To me, it's pretty clear that this dude is hiding something. Now, again, all of this is a dream. It's all taking place in May's head while she recovers from her run-in with the cult. So we can't take this as proof that Mr. Twigmeyer is a cult member. Unless we can figure out why May's subconscious would attribute this kind of suspicious dialogue to Mr. Twigmeyer. In other words, if in May's dream, Mr. Twigmeyer is a cult member, then it must be somehow rooted in reality, in something she noticed in the waking world. And I think I know exactly what that is. Throughout the game, Mr. Twigmeyer's dialogue is flavored with a form of dialect. I went to college in Pittsburgh, which is roughly the same region of Pennsylvania that Night in the Woods takes place in. And it reminds me a lot of what some might describe as Pittsburghese, or as they call it in the Steel City, the Yinzer dialect. The game does a great job of portraying it, in my opinion, as during my time in Pittsburgh, I knew people who spoke some straight-up Yinzer, and others who just had a touch of Pittsburghese here and there, which is a dynamic we definitely see reflected in the citizens of Possum Springs. Stay tuned for an upcoming video about all of the Pittsburgh connections in Night in the Woods for more on that. But in any case, Mr. Twigmeyer is definitely a true Yinzer, and employs that style of speech as much as anyone in the game, except for members of the cult. In both of their appearances, the night she uncovers them, and during her final confrontation with them down in the mines, almost all of the cult members speak with this same dialect, leading credence to the idea that Mr. Twigmeyer is one of them. In fact, it's possible that Mr. Twigmeyer is not only a member, but one of the cult's leaders, namely, the one who carries out the execution of Lerv when May first encounters them outside the mine. He does notice May, even in the darkness, which is something you'd expect Mr. Twigmeyer to be able to do. This theory becomes all the more plausible when you consider the fact that we don't know Mr. Twigmeyer's first name. Before he's murdered by the cult, Lerv pleads with 3 of the cult members and calls them by name: Dave, Rick, and Benny. We know that Dave is the one closest to Lerv. He's the one who holds him still. It's reasonable to assume that Rick is the one next closest to Lerv, aka the leader, or at least the leader in this particular scene, while Benny is the one closest to the cave. Benny doesn't speak at all during this encounter, so May couldn't have recognized him based on his speaking style, meaning that for this theory to work, Mr. Twigmeyer must be Dave or Rick. But if May has lived next door to Mr. Twigmeyer for most of her life, shouldn't she know his first name? Of course she should, but she might not know his nickname. Dave isn't much of a nickname, so that crosses him off our list as well, but Rick is short for Richard. So she might have grown up knowing him as Richard Twigmeyer, and in the heat of the moment, failed to make the connection. May's far from a perfect investigator, and minutes after hearing these names, she's forced to run for her life. So it makes sense that she might not be able to put all those pieces together, forcing her subconscious to do it for her. Also, I grew up with a lot of dudes who were named Rick and Richard, and if you had called the guys who were named Rick, Richard, and the guys who were named Richard, Rick, I would have had no idea who you were talking about. So it is possible that there's just some human error in there as well. Now, if Mr. Twigmeyer is the cult leader in this scene, doesn't that mean that he's the cult leader down in the mines? And wouldn't May, in an extended conversation with him, be able to recognize Mr. Twigmeyer's voice? Well, to the first point, not necessarily. A group like the cult probably has multiple leaders. Ide, for example, clearly has a lot of power and influence in the hierarchy of the cult. He's got the glimmer, something they value, and as evidenced by the Scooby-Doo mystery segments, he spends a lot of time out in historical sites wearing his cult uniform. So he must have some level of authority, otherwise they wouldn't trust him to do this. And yet, he spends most of the scene down in the mines getting talked down to by one of the cult's leaders. This, to me, suggests that there's a bit of a shared power structure at the top, and not one individual leader. If so, this would explain why May doesn't recognize Mr. Twigmeyer's voice, because the person she's speaking to in this scene isn't Mr. Twigmeyer at all, but instead one of the other leaders. I mean, think about it. Ide definitely gives his fellow cultists a heads up that May and her friends are on their way after his encounter with them in the woods. And a good bit of time passes between when Greg shoots Ide with his crossbow and when the group finally makes it down to the mines. So the cult had plenty of time to get their murderous ducks in a row. And as they make abundantly clear in this scene, they put a high value on their anonymity. Thus, it's possible that Mr. Twigmeyer might have passed the conch over to another one of the cult's leaders for this conversation, fully aware that if he were the one to be giving the Make Possum Springs Great Again speech, then May likely would have identified him and blown their cover. All in all, I think we have some good evidence that Mr. Twigmeyer is Rick, one of the cult's leaders. That having been said, I will admit that I might be stretching things a bit here, as this theory does take some heavy lifting. Still, even if he isn't Rick, I have plenty more proof indicating that Mr. Twigmeyer is at least a rank-and-file member. Circling back to that final confrontation with the cult, one of the first things the cult leader down the mine says is that they are out to, quote, protect their own and their neighbors. Protect their own and their neighbors. The use of the word neighbors sure stands out to me, my friends, and might be a wink nod to Mr. Twigmeyer's status as a cult member. And as we know from my last video, cult members and cult supporters are known to do this type of thing. In terms of minor proof, Mr. Twigmeyer does appear to be in his 40s or 50s, so he's the right age to be a cult member. He's also one of only a few goat characters in the game. And what does the cult worship? Well, an entity known as the Black Goat. It is a bit on the nose. But then again, Gary did use the cardboard cutout of a ghost at Harfest, so cult members and cult supporters have a tendency to be kinda on the nose about things. Of course, we've yet to touch on our strongest proof that Mr. Twigmeyer is a cult member, which comes at the very end of the game. In the epilogue, Molly is parked just a few doors down from his house. She's closer to his than she is to Mr. Penderson's. I think it's quite likely that one of the strange calls she received the night before was about Mr. Twigmeyer. Maybe his wife or one of his kids reported him missing. All of this leads me to believe that when Molly stopped short of asking May if she's seen someone, she had intended to ask her about Mr. Twigmeyer. It also makes sense from a cop perspective. She's his next door neighbor, so if Mr. Twigmeyer is indeed missing, she'd certainly be on the list of people for a police officer to check in with. And once again, he appears in the dream segment, so the developers were clearly trying to put him back on our radar, only for him to be so suspiciously absent from the epilogue. So in the case of Mr. Twigmeyer, I think it's highly likely that he's a cult member. He might even be Rick, one of the cult's leaders. There's some good evidence pointing in that direction, but I'm not as sold on that as I am about my belief that he's at least a rank-and-file member. I think we can just about take that one to the bank. At least, as much as you can for a theory. But if I'm right, then my next question is why? Why, from a narrative perspective, would the developers want this seemingly kind, unassuming neighbor to be a cult member? Well, I think it raises a powerful point about the sometimes silent nature of the conservative ideology that the cult expresses. I mean, think about the political landscape the last 7 years. How often have you been shocked to learn that someone you thought was kind and welcoming was actually a person with a horrifying outlook on the world? It's happened to me far more often than I'd like to admit, to the point where, when it happens now, I'm not shocked. I'm just really disappointed. If he is indeed a cult member, then Mr. Twigmeyer is that idea distilled down to a single character. Not everyone who join up with a murder cult are those we'd expect, like Gary from the city council. Some are the quiet ones, like Mr. Twigmeyer. But Mr. Twigmeyer isn't the only person with this profile who I have suspicions about. There's another character whose absence the game draws attention to, even before the epilogue begins. So be sure to tune in for my next theory video, as we explore the possibility that B's dad, Mr. Santello, is a cult member. Thanks for watching. This video was supposed to cover every minor character who I think might have an association with the cult, but then I realized I had about 17 minutes worth of video on just 2 characters who barely speak in this game, so I needed to cut things down and break it up a little bit. Huge shout out to Wolf.Godwin for continuing to allow me to use their Night in the Woods covers for these videos, and to Jordi Jaen Morales Moreno for providing the profile picture and cover art for my channel. Next week, I'll be doing something a bit different, as I'll be dropping a video on Kim Kitsuragi from Disco Elysium, but then it'll be back to the usual, as I'll be dropping a video on the promotional images from Revenant Hill. See you guys then.